I still remember the weight of that silence, how it pressed against my chest like water, drowning out everything that had come before. The laughter, the easy deflections, the safety of pretending none of it mattered. It was supposed to be another night like the rest. We had fallen into this rhythm over the months, Ezra and I, cards scattered across my coffee table, the amber glow of my desk lamp casting long shadows across the room, empty bottles collecting at our feet like forgotten promises. The apartment felt smaller when he was there, not because of his presence, but because of how much space his energy took up. He had this way of filling every corner with noise, with movement, with the kind of restless electricity that made you forget to breathe properly. That night, we had been playing some variation of poker that neither of us really understood, using quarters and bottle caps as currency, because we were both too broke to risk real money. The cards stuck to the table from spilled beer, and Ezra kept cheating in ways so obvious it became part of the game itself. He would slide an extra card from the deck while maintaining eye contact, daring me to call him out, that crooked smile pulling at the corner of his mouth like he was perpetually on the verge of revealing some magnificent secret. I loved that smile. I had spent months memorizing its variations. The sharp flash when he was being sarcastic, the soft curve when he was genuinely amused, the way it faltered for just a fraction of a second before he said something that cut too close to truth. I told myself I was just observant, that friends noticed these things about each other. The television murmured in the background, some late-night talk show neither of us was watching, casting shifting blue light across Ezra's face as he leaned back in his chair. His dark hair had grown longer over the semester, falling into his eyes in a way that made him push it back with increasing frequency, a gesture I found myself tracking without permission. He wore the same faded green sweater he always wore on Thursday nights, the one with the small hole near the left elbow that he refused to throw away because his sister had given it to him before she moved to Portland. We had been friends for 2 years by then. 2 years of late nights and shared silences, of inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else, of the kind of comfortable intimacy that develops between people who have seen each other at their worst and chosen to stay anyway. Ezra had held my hair back when I got food poisoning from that questionable sushi place downtown. I had driven him to the hospital when he broke his wrist skateboarding in a parking lot at 3 in the morning. We knew each other's sleep schedules, coffee preferences, the specific way each of us looked when we were trying not to cry. But there were things we didn't talk about. Careful boundaries we had constructed without ever acknowledging their existence. The way his hand sometimes lingered when he passed me something. The way I found reasons to touch his shoulder when I laughed at his jokes. The way certain conversations would veer toward dangerous territory before one of us would redirect with a well-timed quip or dramatic change of subject. That night, those boundaries felt thinner than usual. Maybe it was the beer or the way the semester was winding down and everything felt suspended in that strange space between endings and beginnings. Maybe it was the fact that we were both avoiding studying for finals, finding refuge in each other's company instead of facing the stack of textbooks that waited in my bedroom like silent accusations. Ezra had been losing badly at cards, which put him in one of those moods where his humor turned sharper, more reckless. He started making increasingly ridiculous bets, first his quarters, then his bottle caps, then random objects from around my apartment. The stapler, the ceramic mug shaped like a cat that my grandmother had given me, the small succulent that sat on my windowsill, barely alive despite my best efforts. And then, with that particular brand of casual audacity that made him impossible to ignore, he had leaned forward across the table, his eyes bright with mischief and something else I couldn't quite name, and said it. "Bet you'd kiss me if I asked." The words landed between us like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the careful equilibrium we had maintained. I felt my breath catch, my chest tightening with the sudden awareness of how small the space between us had become. The air seemed to shift, becoming denser, more electric. Even the television seemed to lower its volume, as if the entire apartment was holding its breath. I laughed. Of course I laughed. It was what we did, what we had always done. Deflect with humor. Turn the sharp edges of honesty into something safer, more manageable. I shoved his shoulder the way I had done countless times before, the same gesture that had become our shorthand for your being ridiculous, and I care about you, and please don't make me think about this too hard all rolled into one. But even as I laughed, I watched his face. I saw the way his smile flickered, uncertain for just a moment before settling back into its familiar shape. I saw how his eyes searched mine, looking for something I wasn't sure I was ready to give him. And when my laughter finally faded, when the echo of it dissolved into the quiet spaces of my apartment, he didn't look away. That was when I knew, when the careful architecture of our friendship shifted just enough to let in a different kind of light. Because Ezra always looked away. He deflected, redirected, filled every silence with movement or sound or the next joke in an endless sequence designed to keep us both from examining what lay beneath the surface. But not that night. That night, his gaze held mine with a steadiness that felt both terrifying and inevitable. His eyes, dark brown with flecks of gold that caught the lamplight, carried a weight I had never seen there before. Or maybe I'd seen it, but had chosen to look away to preserve the delicate balance that kept us both safe. The game was forgotten. The cards lay abandoned on the table, corners curling slightly from the humidity. The bottle caps scattered like small, worthless coins. The television continued its quiet monologue to an audience of two people who were no longer listening. In that silence, I felt something fundamental shift between us. A recognition, maybe, or an acknowledgement of something that had been building for months, gathering strength in the spaces between words, in the moments when our eyes met and held a beat too long, in the careful way we had learned to navigate around the growing weight of everything we weren't saying. My throat felt tight. The apartment, which had always felt too small when Ezra was there, now felt impossibly intimate. I was suddenly aware of the distance between us, barely 3 feet of coffee table and accumulated clutter, and how easy it would be to close that gap. How little effort it would take to lean forward, to reach across that space and touch his face, to answer the question in his eyes with something more than nervous laughter. But I didn't move. Couldn't move. Because moving would mean acknowledging that the joke wasn't entirely a joke, that the dare carried real weight, that the look in his eyes was saying things that would change everything between us. And despite the way my heart was racing, despite the way my skin felt too warm and too tight, I wasn't sure I was ready for everything to change. So we sat there in that charged silence, neither of us speaking, neither of us looking away. The moment stretched between us like a bridge we weren't quite brave enough to cross. And for the first time in our friendship, the silence felt louder than any laughter we had ever shared. I should tell you about the apartment, about how it became the center of everything, the place where our friendship grew into something I couldn't name, but couldn't ignore either. It wasn't much to look at. A converted studio on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades, with thin walls that let in the sound of my upstairs neighbor's television and pipes that groaned like old bones whenever someone ran water. But it was mine, the first space I had ever claimed entirely for myself, and somehow that made it feel larger than its actual square footage suggested. The main room served as everything: living room, dining room, study, sanctuary. My bed was tucked into an alcove near the window, separated from the rest of the space by a bookshelf I had built myself from second-hand lumber and stubbornness. Books filled every available surface, not organized by any system that would make sense to anyone else, but perfectly logical to me. History texts stacked beside poetry collections, biographies leaning against novels I had read so many times their spines had cracked and softened. My desk occupied the corner near the window, usually buried under papers and coffee cups and the detritus of a life lived in academic pursuit. I was 22 then, finishing my degree in history, spending most of my time buried in archives and primary sources, trying to make sense of how people had lived and loved and died in centuries past. There was something comforting about studying lives that had already reached their conclusions, stories whose endings were fixed and knowable. The present felt so much messier, so much more uncertain. My friends from class would sometimes joke that I was becoming a hermit, that I spent too much time with dead people and dusty books. They weren't entirely wrong. I had always been more comfortable in quiet spaces, more at ease with written words than spoken ones. I used humor the way other people used armor, as protection against the world's sharper edges, as a way to deflect attention from the parts of myself I wasn't ready to examine. But Ezra had never seemed to mind the quiet. From the beginning, he had moved through my space like he belonged there, rearranging my carefully ordered chaos with an ease that should have been irritating, but somehow wasn't. He would arrive unannounced, usually with takeout or coffee or some ridiculous story about his day, and within minutes the apartment would transform. His energy filled the corners I kept carefully contained, made the space feel less like a hiding place and more like a home. Ezra was a year older, 23, but he carried himself with the kind of restless confidence that made age feel irrelevant. He was studying communications, though he spent more time skipping classes than attending them, much to his professor's frustration and his own apparent amusement. He had this magnetic quality that drew people to him without effort, the kind of person who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new friends and an invitation to someone's birthday party. But with me, he was different. Quieter, maybe. More willing to let silence exist without rushing to fill it. He would stretch out on my couch like a cat claiming territory, his long legs draped over the armrest, and we would talk for hours about everything and nothing. Books we had read, movies we wanted to see, the strange dreams that visited us in the early morning hours. He had opinions about everything, delivered with the kind of passionate conviction that made even his most ridiculous theories sound almost plausible. The apartment had witnessed our friendship in all its variations. Late-night study sessions that devolved into philosophical debates. Mornings when one of us had crashed on the couch after drinking too much cheap wine and talking until sunrise. Afternoons when we lay on the floor listening to music, passing books back and forth, existing in the kind of comfortable parallel silence that only comes with deep familiarity. Ezra kept a spare toothbrush in my bathroom cabinet. His favorite coffee mug, a chipped ceramic thing with a faded logo from some band neither of us had heard of, lived permanently in my dish rack. There were nights when I would come home from the library to find him already there, having let himself in with the spare key I had given him months earlier, cooking something that smelled infinitely better than anything I had ever managed to produce in that kitchen. Our friendship had always been physical in the unconscious way of people who trust each other completely. Casual touches, playful shoves, the kind of easy intimacy that develops between friends who have moved beyond the careful boundaries that govern most relationships. Ezra would lean against me while we watched movies, his shoulder warm against mine. I would steal food from his plate without asking permission. We wrestled over the remote control like children, laughing until our sides ached. I told myself that was all it was. Friendship in its purest form, uncomplicated by the kinds of feelings that might make things awkward or difficult. I had become expert at not noticing the way my pulse quickened when he smiled at me in a certain way, and not examining too closely why I looked forward to his visits with an intensity that felt almost urgent. But that night, after the cards and the beer and the weight of his gaze holding mine across the coffee table, something had shifted. The careful equilibrium we had maintained for 2 years had been disturbed, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. The look that had passed between us in that charged silence had revealed something I had been working very hard not to see. Now, in the quiet of my apartment after he had finally left, I could feel the change like a physical presence. The space felt different somehow, charged with the memory of that moment. Even the familiar objects, the books, the coffee table still scattered with abandoned cards, the couch where we had sat countless times before, seemed to carry new significance. The game was forgotten, but the look had remained, burned into my memory with the kind of clarity that comes with moments that divide your life into before and after. And I knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified me, that we could never go back to the easy simplicity of what we had been before. The next day arrived with the particular cruelty of morning light streaming through my apartment windows, illuminating the evidence of the night before. The cards still lay scattered across the coffee table, bottle caps catching the sun like small copper coins. I stood in my kitchen, making coffee with shaking hands, trying to convince myself that nothing had fundamentally changed. When Ezra showed up that afternoon, he was exactly as he had always been, or at least, he was performing the role of himself with such practiced ease that I almost believed it. He burst through my door with his usual energy, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place down the street and a story about his economics professor that had him laughing before he even reached the punchline. I watched him settle onto my couch, watched him arrange himself in that familiar sprawl that claimed half the space and somehow made the entire room feel more alive. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he leaned forward to steal one of my textbooks, flipping through the pages with the kind of idle curiosity that had always charmed me. Everything about him seemed unchanged. The easy smile, the restless energy, the way he filled silence with movement and sound. But I'd learned to read the smaller signs. The way his eyes moved too quickly from object to object, never quite settling. The slightly forced quality of his laughter. The way his fingers drummed against his coffee cup in a rhythm that spoke of nerves rather than casual energy. He was working harder than usual to maintain the performance, and that effort itself was a kind of confession. For the first few hours, we managed to maintain the illusion. We talked about finals, about his sister's upcoming visit, about the documentary we had been meaning to watch. He made jokes about my study habits. I made jokes about his apparent inability to take anything seriously. We fell back into our familiar patterns like actors returning to a well-rehearsed script. But underneath the surface normalcy, something had shifted. I found myself hyper-aware of his presence in ways that felt both new and achingly familiar. The way he gestured when he spoke, hands moving through the air like he was conducting an orchestra only he could hear. The sound of his voice, deeper than I had remembered, with that slight roughness that appeared when he was tired or thinking hard about something. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, glances that lasted a fraction of a second too long before he redirected his attention elsewhere. It was during one of these moments of manufactured normalcy that the careful facade began to crack. We had been debating the merits of some historical biography I was supposed to be reading, our conversation growing animated in the way it always did when we disagreed about something that didn't actually matter. Ezra was arguing his point with increasing passion, gesturing wildly with his coffee cup, when he paused mid-sentence and looked at me with sudden intensity. The silence stretched between us, loaded with the memory of the night before. I could see him weighing his words, deciding how much truth to let slip through. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that particular quality it took on when he was pretending to joke about something that wasn't really a joke at all. "You're too easy to fall for," he said, the words delivered with a crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The comment hung in the air between us, too heavy to be dismissed as mere banter, too loaded with meaning to be absorbed without consequence. I felt my breath catch, the same tightness in my chest that I had experienced the night before. Because this was how it always happened with Ezra. He would say something that cut straight to the heart of everything we weren't discussing, deliver it with just enough humor to maintain plausible deniability, and then wait to see how I would respond. I forced a laugh, the sound brittle even to my own ears. "Too easy for who?" I asked, trying to match his tone, trying to pretend my heart wasn't racing. His smile flickered, and for a moment I saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression before he covered it with another laugh. "For anyone with sense," he said, but his voice cracked slightly on the words, betraying the studied casualness he was trying to project. Over the following days, these moments began to multiply. Comments that weren't quite jokes, observations that carried more weight than they should have, glances that lingered longer than friendship typically allowed. Ezra would say something like, "Bet you'd never let go if I held you," always followed by that laugh that was becoming increasingly hollow, increasingly desperate. I found myself waiting for these moments, anticipating them with a mixture of dread and longing that I couldn't quite name. Each comment felt like a test, a question disguised as humor, an invitation wrapped in the safety of potential dismissal. And each time, I would respond with my own carefully calibrated laughter, my own deflection, maintaining the delicate balance that kept us both safe from having to acknowledge what was really happening. But safety, I was beginning to realize, came at a cost. Every laugh that followed one of his loaded comments felt like a small betrayal, a denial of something that was growing stronger between us with each passing day. The jokes were becoming a prison, a way of circling around the truth without ever quite touching it. I started to listen differently to the silence that followed his laughter. In those brief moments before conversation resumed, before the next joke or observation or casual deflection, I could hear something else, something that sounded almost like longing, like a question that was never quite asked but always present, hovering in the spaces between words. And slowly, carefully, I began to understand that the laughter wasn't protection at all. It was admission. Every joke was a confession wrapped in humor. Every laugh was a way of saying things he couldn't say directly. The performance wasn't hiding his feelings. It was the only way he knew how to express them. The realization terrified me because it meant that everything I had been telling myself about our friendship, about the careful boundaries we maintained, about the safety of our easy intimacy, had been built on a foundation that was far less stable than I had believed. The jokes weren't keeping us safe. They were slowly, inexorably, drawing us towards something that would change everything. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, like watching seasons change, so subtle in its daily progress that you might miss it entirely unless you knew to pay attention. But I was paying attention now, hyper-aware of every shift in tone, every pause that lasted a moment too long, every joke that carried more weight than it should have. The comments grew sharper over the following weeks, edged with something that felt increasingly like confession. Ezra would arrive at my apartment with that same easy energy, that same crooked smile, but underneath the familiar performance, something had begun to pulse like a second heartbeat. The jokes came more frequently now, each one landing a little closer to the truth we were both circling. We would be sitting on my couch, studying or watching television or simply existing in each other's presence, when he would say something that made the air between us crackle with electricity. "But you'd look good in my sweater," he said one evening, his voice casual, but his eyes anything but. The comment was delivered with his trademark grin, but I caught the way his breath hitched slightly after he said it, the way he watched my face for some telltale reaction. I had learned to recognize the pattern by then. The joke, delivered with just enough levity to maintain deniability. The laugh that followed, a little too bright, a little too forced. And then the silence that settled between us afterward, heavy with everything neither of us was saying. Those silences were becoming longer, more charged, more difficult to navigate back to safer territory. But it was the way he looked at me during those moments that undid me completely. Gone was the easy deflection, the quick redirection of attention that had always characterized our interactions. Instead, his gaze would hold mine with an intensity that felt almost physical, as if he were trying to communicate something vital through sight alone. His dark eyes, which had always been expressive, now seemed to carry entire conversations, questions and admissions and possibilities that made my chest tight with anticipation. One Thursday night, as we sat cross-legged on my floor sorting through a box of old photographs I'd found while cleaning, he made a comment that stopped me mid-breath. We had been laughing at a particularly embarrassing picture of me from freshman year when he suddenly went quiet, his fingers stilling on the photograph in his hand. "Bet you'd never let me take a picture like this of you now," he said, his voice softer than usual. The words themselves were innocuous enough, but the way he said them, with that particular combination of longing and challenge that had become his signature, made them feel like so much more. I looked up to find him watching me with that expression I was learning to recognize, the one that made it impossible to pretend we were still safely in the realm of casual friendship. His face was closer than it should have been, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that I could count the individual lashes that framed them. "What kind of picture?" I heard myself ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The question surprised me with its boldness, with the way it seemed to acknowledge that we had moved beyond the territory of simple jokes. "Something real," he said, and the way he said it, without the protective coating of laughter, without the safety net of humor, made my heart slam against my ribs. "Something that shows who you actually are." The photograph slipped from my fingers, forgotten. We sat there on my apartment floor, surrounded by scattered memories, staring at each other across a distance that felt both infinite and negligible. I could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that we were balanced on the edge of something that would either destroy our friendship or transform it into something entirely different. But then, as if summoned by the intensity of the silence, his laugh returned. Bright and sharp and desperately casual. He picked up another photograph, made some joke about my terrible haircut from sophomore year, and the moment dissolved like sugar in water. But I had seen what lay beneath the laughter now, had glimpsed the raw one in his eyes before he covered it up again. It was after that night that I began to change too. I found myself responding differently to his loaded comments, allowing my own silences to stretch longer, letting my own gaze linger in ways that might be interpreted as more than friendly. The careful dance we had been performing was becoming more complex, more dangerous, more honest. When he joked about holding me, I didn't immediately laugh it off. When he made comments about how I looked, or what I might like, or what he imagined I was thinking, I let myself really hear him instead of deflecting with humor. And slowly, carefully, I began to understand that he was waiting for something from me. Some signal that it was safe to stop hiding behind the jokes. Some indication that the feelings I saw flickering in his eyes might be reciprocated. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying, because acknowledging what was happening between us would mean admitting that everything I thought I knew about our friendship had been incomplete. It would mean confessing that the easy intimacy we shared had been building towards something more complex, more vulnerable, more real. One night, after another of his comments that wasn't quite a joke, something about how I made him feel less alone in the world, I didn't laugh at all. I just looked at him, really looked at him, and let the silence stretch between us without rushing to fill it. His smile faded slowly, replaced by something raw and uncertain and achingly hopeful. We sat there in that charged quiet, both of us breathing a little too quickly, both of us afraid to move or speak or do anything that might shatter the fragile honesty of the moment. And for the first time since this all began, there were no jokes left to hide behind. Just the truth, suspended in the air between us like something precious and breakable, waiting to see if we were brave enough to catch it. The question had been building inside me for days, maybe weeks, growing heavier with each loaded comment, each laugh that rang increasingly hollow, each silence that stretched between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. It lived in my chest like something alive, demanding acknowledgement, refusing to be ignored any longer. We were sitting in my apartment on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of gray day that made the world outside feel distant and unreal. Ezra had arrived earlier with coffee and pastries from the bakery near campus, settling into what had become his usual spot on my couch with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. We had been reading in comfortable parallel silence, the kind of shared quiet that had always been one of the foundations of our friendship. But the silence felt different now, charged, expectant. Every few minutes, I would catch him glancing at me over the top of his book, his eyes carrying that weight I had learned to recognize. When our gazes met, he would smile that crooked smile that had once felt like pure joy but now seemed tinged with something more complex, more vulnerable. It was when he made another of his comments, something about how peaceful I looked when I was reading, delivered with that particular tone that wasn't quite teasing, wasn't quite serious, that I finally couldn't contain the question any longer. The words spilled out of me before I had fully decided to say them, driven by a need for clarity that had become impossible to ignore. Why do you always laugh after you say it? The question landed between us like a stone thrown in a glass. Ezra's book slipped from his fingers, forgotten, and I watched as every trace of casual humor drained from his expression. For a moment, he looked almost panicked, like someone who had been caught in the act of revealing something they had meant to keep hidden. The silence that followed was different from all the others. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of shared understanding or even the charged tension of unspoken attraction. This was the silence of truth hovering in the air, waiting to be acknowledged or denied, waiting to either bridge the gap between us or widen it beyond repair. I could see him struggling with the question, watching the careful masks he had constructed over months of careful jokes and deflections begin to crack. His hands, which were usually in constant motion, lay still against his thighs. His breathing had become slightly uneven, and I could see the pulse jumping in his throat like a trapped bird. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of the confident energy that usually characterized everything he said. Because if I don't laugh, you'll know I mean it. The admission hung between us, raw and honest, and terrifying in its simplicity. It was the answer I had suspected, maybe even hoped for, but hearing it spoken aloud made my chest tight with something that felt like fear and anticipation and relief all tangled together. But I needed more than that. I needed him to say it completely, to strip away the last vestiges of protection and tell me what we were really talking about. The question that followed came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything we had been circling around for weeks. And do you? The seconds stretched between us like hours. I watched him weigh the question, saw him recognize that this was the moment when everything would change, when the careful balance we had maintained would either evolve into something new or shatter completely. His eyes never left mine, and in them I could see years of friendship, months of careful deflection, weeks of increasingly desperate jokes, all leading to this single moment of truth. Mean it. His voice cracked slightly on the words, and I realized that despite all his jokes and loaded comments and meaningful glances, he was just as scared as I was, just as uncertain about what lay on the other side of honesty, just as aware that once certain things were said, they could never be unsaid. Every time, he said finally, the words so quiet I might have missed them if I hadn't been holding my breath, waiting. Every single time, the admission settled between us like something fragile and precious. No laughter followed it, no joke to soften its impact, no deflection to make it safer or easier to dismiss. Just the truth, stark and vulnerable and absolutely terrifying in its completeness. I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of everything that had passed between us. Every casual touch that had lingered a moment too long. Every glance that had carried more weight than friendship typically allowed. Every joke that had felt too loaded, too meaningful, too much like confession disguised as humor. All of it had been real. All of it had been intentional. All of it had been his way of trying to tell me something he couldn't say directly. The room felt smaller suddenly, more intimate, as if the space between us had contracted with the weight of his confession. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and insistent, and I wondered if he could hear it too. Could see the way my hands were trembling slightly, the way my breath had become shallow and quick. We sat there in that transformed silence, both of us afraid to move, afraid to speak, afraid to do anything that might break the spell of honesty that had settled over us. But the truth was out now, impossible to take back, impossible to laugh away. It lived in the space between us like something alive, demanding a response, refusing to be ignored. And for the first time in our friendship, I understood that the next words spoken would determine everything that came after. The careful dance we had been performing was over. The jokes and deflections and protective laughter had served their purpose and been found wanting. What remained was just the two of us, stripped of pretense, waiting to see if the truth we had finally acknowledged would bring us together or tear us apart. The truth had been spoken, but it hung between us like something suspended in amber, beautiful and precious and utterly fragile. Days passed after his confession, and neither of us seemed to know how to navigate this new territory we had entered. The jokes returned, but they felt different now, hollow and performative, like actors reciting lines from a play they no longer believed in. Ezra still came to my apartment with the same frequency, still brought coffee and stories, and that restless energy that had always defined him. But there was something careful in the way he moved through my space now, as if he were afraid of disturbing something that might shatter at the slightest touch. We talked around the confession, never quite acknowledging it directly, but its presence colored every interaction like light filtering through stained glass. I found myself watching him more openly now, no longer pretending that my attention was casual or accidental. The way he ran his fingers through his dark hair when he was thinking. The way his laugh sounded when it was genuine versus when it was protective. The way he looked at me when he thought I might not notice, with a mixture of hope and fear that made my chest ache with recognition. It was on a Thursday night, exactly 1 week after his confession, that the fragile equilibrium we had been maintaining finally collapsed completely. We were sitting on my couch, ostensibly watching a movie, but really just existing in each other's presence, when he started the familiar routine again. Some comment about how I looked in the lamplight, delivered with that crooked smile I had memorized in all its variations. But this time, I couldn't let it pass. Couldn't let him retreat back into the safety of humor after what he had told me. The question that emerged from me was different from all the others, sharper and more direct, cutting through the protective layers we had both been hiding behind. Why are you still doing this? He looked at me with genuine confusion, the practiced smile faltering. Doing what? Making jokes about things, you mean? Hiding behind laughter. Pretending we didn't have that conversation. The silence that followed was thick with everything we weren't saying. I watched him struggle with the directness of the question, saw him realize that the old deflections weren't going to work anymore. The truth had changed the rules of engagement between us, and we were both still learning how to play by them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, edged with something that sounded almost like desperation. Because I don't know what else to do. Because the joke is safer than the alternative. What alternative? The question came out more forcefully than I had intended, carrying with it weeks of accumulated frustration and longing and the strange courage that comes with having nothing left to lose. I was tired of the dance we had been performing, tired of the careful steps that kept us always just out of reach of honesty. His eyes met mine then, and I saw something shift in his expression. The careful mask he had been wearing slipped completely, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made the air between us feel electric. Telling you that I think about you constantly, that I've been in love with you for months, that every joke is just another way of saying something I'm too scared to say directly. The words hit me like a physical force, each one landing with the weight of absolute truth. This wasn't another loaded comment disguised as humor. This wasn't a confession wrapped in protective laughter. This was honesty in its purest form, unfiltered and unprotected and breathtaking in its completeness. I felt something inside me break open, some careful wall I had constructed around my own feelings finally crumbling under the weight of his admission. Because hearing him say it, really say it without qualification or deflection, made it impossible to deny what I had been feeling in return. The next time he started to make one of his jokes, started to fall back into the familiar pattern of saying something meaningful and then laughing it away, I didn't let him finish. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us on the couch, my hand reaching out to touch his face before I had fully decided to move. Then stop hiding behind the joke, I whispered, my voice steady despite the way my heart was racing. The words came out firm and clear, carrying with them all the accumulated weight of months of careful distance, a protection we no longer needed, of truth that demanded to be acknowledged. His breath caught, and I watched as every trace of humor drained from his expression. What remained was something unguarded and achingly honest, something that made him look younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. The crooked smile that had been his signature disappeared completely, replaced by something that looked almost like wonder. Slowly, carefully, as if he were afraid I might disappear if he moved too quickly, he leaned toward me. The space between us contracted until I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin, could count the individual lashes that framed his dark eyes, could see the way his pulse jumped in his throat like something caged and desperate for freedom. When our lips finally met, it felt nothing like a dare. It felt like an answer to a question that had been asked months ago, like the completion of a sentence that had been left hanging in the air between us for far too long. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were both afraid of the reality we were creating. But then something shifted, some final barrier falling away, and it became something deeper, more certain, more real than any joke either of us had ever told. When we finally broke apart, breathless and slightly stunned by what had just happened. The silence that settled between us was different from all the others. This wasn't the silence of things unsaid or feelings hidden. This was the silence of truth finally acknowledged, of pretense finally abandoned, of two people who had stopped running for what they meant to each other. No laughter followed. Weeks passed, and the apartment remained the same. The same coffee-stained table where we had played cards that first night. The same couch where we had circled around the truth for months. The same window that let in the afternoon light, casting familiar shadows across the floor. But everything else had changed in ways both subtle and profound, as if the space itself had been rewritten by honesty. The laughter returned, but it was different now. Lighter, maybe, unburdened by the weight of secrets we no longer had to carry. When Ezra made jokes now, they weren't shields or confessions disguised as humor. They were simply jokes, born from genuine amusement rather than desperate deflection. The sharp edge of performance had been worn smooth by truth. I still remember the first time I heard him laugh without that undercurrent of anxiety, without the frantic energy that had characterized so much of our friendship. We were sitting in the kitchen, attempting to cook something that resembled dinner, when he made some ridiculous observation about my organizational system for spices. The laugh that followed was pure and uncomplicated, the sound of someone who no longer had to monitor every word for hidden meaning. It struck me then how exhausting it must have been for him, all those months of careful jokes and loaded comments, trying to communicate feelings through humor while simultaneously protecting himself from the possibility of rejection. How much energy he had spent crafting the perfect balance between revelation and safety, walking the tightrope between honesty and plausible deniability. But now, in the quiet aftermath of truth acknowledged and reciprocated, he moved through my apartment with a different kind of ease. His presence had always filled the space, but there was something more settled about it now, less restless, less desperate to maintain constant motion lest silence reveal too much. He would sit in comfortable quiet, reading or thinking or simply existing, without the compulsive need to fill every moment with sound. The jokes we shared now felt cleaner somehow, motivated by joy rather than fear. When he teased me about my study habits or my questionable taste in late-night snacks, the comments carried only affection, only the kind of gentle ribbing that comes from intimate knowledge of another person's quirks and failings. No hidden messages, no desperate attempts to communicate something too dangerous to say directly. And sometimes, in the spaces between the laughter, he would just look at me, not with the careful calculation I had learned to recognize, not with the hope and fear that had characterized his gaze for so many months, but with something that felt like peace, like someone who had been holding their breath for a very long time and had finally been given permission to exhale. These moments of quiet observation have become some of my favorites. When we would be watching a movie or reading in parallel silence, and I would catch him studying my face with that expression of wonder that still appeared sometimes, as if he couldn't quite believe that the wanting was allowed now, that the feelings he had carried in secret for so long were not only acknowledged but returned. The physical ease between us had evolved too. The casual touches that had always been part of our friendship now carried different weight, charged with acknowledgement rather than careful restraint. When he reached for my hand while we walked, when he leaned against me on the couch, when he traced absent patterns on my arm while we talked, these gestures felt both familiar and entirely new, like returning to a place you had never quite been allowed to fully inhabit. But it was the way he looked at me in those unguarded moments that revealed the true transformation. The careful mask of casual friendship had been replaced by something more honest, more vulnerable, more real. When he watched me now, I could see everything he felt written clearly in his expression. No more coded messages, no more protective laughter, just the clear, uncomplicated truth of someone who had stopped hiding from what they wanted. One evening, as we sat together in the lamplight, I made some offhand comment about the way the shadows fell across his face. It was the kind of observation that months ago would have sent us both scrambling for safer ground, would have required immediate deflection or nervous laughter to restore the careful balance of our friendship. Instead, he simply smiled. Not the crooked, defensive smile that had been his signature for so long, but something softer, more genuine. Something that reached his eyes and stayed there without the frantic energy that had once characterized every expression. "You can just say things like that now," he said quietly, and there was something almost amazed in his voice, as if he were still getting used to the idea that compliments and observations and affection could exist between us without requiring elaborate justification or protective humor. I realized then that this was what safety looked like. Not the careful distance we had maintained for so long, not the elaborate dance of almost confessions and protective deflections, but this quiet space where feelings could exist without apology, where truth didn't require disguise, where love could be acknowledged simply and directly without fear of destruction. The first time had been a joke, born from alcohol and proximity and the particular courage that comes with late-night vulnerability. But this settled contentment, this easy intimacy, this freedom from the exhausting performance of protecting ourselves from our own feelings, this was something else entirely. Now, when he looked at me in those moments between words, between laughs, between the ordinary business of existing together, there was no laughter that followed, because the look itself had become enough. The truth had become enough. We had become enough, finally and completely, for each other.